There are so many stories that are about the nature of being human, and we get to this right at the very end with Dr. Carballo, which is that you study the past in order to be able to learn a lesson for the future. And the future doesn't look like the past. It's something that I always remind myself. Like, the technology that we have today throws a monkey wrench into whatever gears you might find from the past, but I do think that there's an essence of the human spirit that is always the same from time to time to time.
Anyways, you guys are going to enjoy this one. He's a little rough on Graham Hancock crew, but hey, Graham Hancock won't answer our emails, so he's welcome to come out and...
is thrown, Graham Hancock.
Graham, come on out and tell us what we're missing about this story. Probably are missing stuff. And so guys, email Hancock, tell him to come do the show.
If you enjoy what we do, support us on Patreon. We're at patreon.com/DemystifySci. We thrive on donations from viewers and listeners like you. So if you have a couple bucks to spare, consider joining. We are soon going to get stickers, and Patreons, when you join up, get a DemystifySci podcast sticker.
Yeah, plus you get to come just hang out, do our weekly hangouts, and help us figure out what comes next with this. And we're going to end up figuring out how to make this all live and take it on the road and do all kinds of cool stuff. So
tell your friends.
Also, if you want to talk about these things, come out to Discord, come out to Facebook. There's lots of places you can discuss it. Leave a comment, and we will figure out where to go from here.
Enjoy Dr. David Carballo on Teotihuacan and Mesoamerican civilization. We will see you soon.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
We don't hear a lot about these civilizations in America prior to, I don't know, a couple thousand BC or something like that. But surely there must have been stuff going on. And of course, the glaciation would have taken care of all the stuff up north. But what was going on in that period, just to sort of contrast the story of the modern tech, of some mysterious technological civilization being proposed by Hancock and others?
Yeah. So, I should say, and this is where science is a work in progress, always, the first arrivals into the Western Hemisphere, that date has moved back in my own career as being an archaeologist. So it
dramatically.
It used to be sort of 12,000, 13,000 years ago was the first peopling of the Americas, or the first migrants coming in, and now those dates seem to get older and older. And it's hard to say what is consensus, but there's I feel like there are people like myself who would think, okay, it's likely 20,000 or earlier, and maybe even much earlier. Paulette Steeves is an Indigenous scholar from Canada who wrote a recent book that's called The Indigenous Paleolithic of the Western Hemisphere. And, she proposes there's evidence going back over 100,000 years ago. Now that, it is a empirical claim that can be evaluated in different ways over time. And this is actually so radiocarbon dating is very accurate until about 50,000 years ago. And then it gets problematic. It's because the half-life is roughly about 5,000 years. By that time, there's so little of the material to detect, it gets difficult. And so then we need to use other dating methods. There is a mass spectrometry technique that can sort of push back radiocarbon dating further, maybe getting towards 100,000. But then the other great radiometric technique that especially paleoanthropologists and geologists use to date some of the earliest rocks in the world is potassium argon dating. That has a very long half-life, and so you can't see the decay until about maybe 500,000 years ago. So we have this sort of gap between so this would be in the sort of human evolution fossil record between 500,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago, where you need to have these other techniques. And they do exist. There is forms of luminescence dating, uranium series dating, obsidian hydration dating. And And any of those could be taught in a K through 12 curriculum, just the basics, like just to, people don't need, I don't know it at a high level. I'm not a specialist in those dating techniques, but just to know that, this is the same scientific understanding that brought us nuclear power and, the nuclear age. Like we had to understand that these principles of radioactive decay. And then Libby, who won the Nobel Prize for applying it to radiocarbon dating, showed that this could be used for this particular carbon isotope. And since life on this planet is carbon based, then anything that was formerly organic, including humans themselves, the stuff we ate, the animals, the plants, the shells we decorated our bodies with, the wood we burned or built houses with, all of that is datable. And so any archaeologist that sees a show that's not using a single radiocarbon date, like immediately that's just red flags everywhere. And that's a pseudoscience. Like you need to engage with the tools that have developed over, in this case, since the late 40s, the technique was developed.
I mean, one of the things, those guys are so good at painting a picture of what in people's minds of what these people, whether they exist or not, lived like and looked like. And it's something I just don't have a sense for about the mainstream archaeological ideas is what were these people, what was their civilization like? Is it inherently bound by the fact that we can only make statements about these like trace organic pieces that we find that we can't put together such a vivid imagination of their lives, or what is it? Because I think that's the gap that these journalists are filling in, that scientists maybe aren't willing to, science being inherently conservative and really fixated on telling barely a story, but like bringing just the evidence and linking it together.
Who are the they here?
I mean, so art, you mean like
the people of the ancient times?
So my question was like, because you're saying like we don't have a good picture of who
the peoples of the Americas, like during the Ice Ages. Like
I think that Hancock's whole thing is that the peoples of the America, like Atlantis, is at the center of the Graham Hancock story, right?
Like a global civilization.
Yeah, he stopped using the term. But
there's a Greek island. There's a race of highly advanced people there.
I think they think it was off the coast of Africa. Actually, because somebody's going to light us up for this.
Yeah. We haven't watched the show yet, so it's like third hand. But basically,
just post this on Twitter and tag Ancient Apocalypse, right? And you'll see all the trolls will come out.
But so
so I didn't answer your question about like what do they look like, right? So
or like what were their daily lives like? Or like what kind of what were they into?
So this is a big hemisphere, right? So it depends where they were. And so I would say like the original model of the first people to arrive in the Americas is associated with a spear point technology called Clovis. And Clovis is this beautifully made large spear point. So you can actually pore over pages of National Geographic reconstructions of what Clovis hunters looked like. Clearly, they're making these big spears. So they're hunting something large. There are large animals at that time, megafauna. So they're, woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos and bigger bisons than we have today and saber-toothed cats and all that sort of thing. And that often they were depicted in that way. These are largely carnivore hunters moving through the landscape in a cold climate. And so they're depicted as, bundled up with parkas, like organically made parkas, of course. But so the one site that started to first challenge that narrative is in Chile, all the way down in the tip of South America, called Monteverde. And that was excavated. Tom Dillahay, who's at Vanderbilt still, he was the archaeologist who explored that site. There's very solid occupation that is pre-Clovis at that site, and some that might date back as far as, say, 30,000 years ago. So it's pretty solid that 15,000 years ago, there's occupation. And there's good organic preservation because there was wet preservation. So there's some of the stakes of the tent-like houses that they had. And so you can there are reconstructions. If you Google Monteverde reconstruction, you can get a sense of what the houses looked like. And they would have lived in a very different environment. They weren't eating large game like that. They were sort of fisher foragers living, in a more coastal environment. And so,
did they have cities, by the way? Are these like cities of tents, or they're nomadic to some extent?
Yeah.
Or?
I mean, I wouldn't say, by my definition of cities, I tend to have a more restrictive definition of cities. I would say that there are urban centers in the Americas starting around 3000 BCE or 5,000 years ago in places like the Supe Valley of Peru. So if you look at the site of Caral, Caral, in the Supe Valley, really impressive monumental constructions. Certainly urban functions, people like this was a ritual area that served different functions than other parts around it at the time. They still, though, were not really practicing much agriculture. They did grow cotton, and then they turned the cotton into nets to go fish in the Pacific Ocean, which has the Humboldt Current. It is a very rich fishery, and they were interacting with people who live more on the coast. They were more in the interior, in the river valley, where they could grow cotton. And so these are, fisher foragers with incipient agriculture, or more, I guess you could say, like more utilitarian-based agriculture. They're trying to make goods rather than food, and then they're using those tools to then fish and get their food that way.
Is there some sense that those fisher people, isn't there some genetic evidence that there was a peopling from the east as well, to some extent?
Like from Polynesian?
Yeah. What was that? Is that in any way associated with the Peruvian cities, or?
So in terms of the East, I mean, that is debated, and that's an unresolved topic. There was, like, I think it was, I'm not an expert on ancient DNA, I should say, just as a caveat, like, I think there were some in the genome of native peoples who lived around the Great Lakes, that there were some markers that seemed to indicate potential European ancestry. But I think now, with more of the genome fleshed out, that doesn't seem to be true anymore. That it really all points to Northeast Asia and across. Oh yeah,
sorry. By east, I meant for them it would be the west, I guess. I was thinking like from Polynesia and so forth.
Americas.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
it's like
So yeah, no, it does seem to be like more and more genetic studies are confirming and sort of Northeast Asian origin spot. Now, but I should say that
even for Peru?
Yeah. So I mean, crossing over Beringia, which is where Russia and Alaska come closest, but the difference is with the Clovis hypothesis, it was always envisioned as a land-based crossing. These are big game hunters, and they're crossing following packs of large animals, and so they're on, and so then people would try to reconstruct, well, was this all ice then? If there's no ice, then there's no tundra for the animals, and they wouldn't be crossing. But there's a period where some ice sheets separate, and it's called the ice-free corridor. And so a lot of the attention was going on that, like, when exactly is that happening? Because in everybody's mind was, these are terrestrial-based big game hunters. But then as the dates moved earlier and earlier, people started thinking, well, couldn't they have come on the coasts? I mean, I don't know how close you live to the coast in Oregon, but there are, sites, of course, since it was the Ice Age, there were, many of the ice caps had sucked up a lot of the ocean water, and sea levels were lower. And so many of these sites then are now underwater, and there are teams of archaeologists in the Pacific Northwest sort of looking for sunken sites. But in this case, I mean, it would be very ephemeral. These would be people, they're not sort of purposefully going out in boats saying, here, America, here I come, right? They don't know it exists there, but just people who have some maritime technology and are hugging the coastline, following, migrating species or whatever the food source is, and setting up camp periodically. But gradually there's sort of a shift into the Americas, and it probably would have been imperceptible to them. I mean, it's the same sort of environment along, the Beringia. And then eventually, of course, they'd be going into very different environments as they went farther south into California, into the Baja Peninsula, There's some work, Matt Delorier, who's in Cal State University. He has worked in a island called Isla Cedros that actually has remains of an early boat, like a sort of balsa raft that is, I think, over 10,000 years old. So, I mean, these technologies are actually documented as existing, and you could imagine those sorts of migrations hugging the coast. But we're missing a lot of the sites. But they would have been small sites. These wouldn't have been big cities. They would have been fisher-forager populations.
And there's a lot of sediment off the Pacific coast as well from the Cascades. And so stuff gets buried over. So you have kind of two things fighting against you to create kind of this, obscurity in the archaeological record, because people are, like you say, setting up temporary cities or urban centers or settlements. But they're also just being covered up actively. Like after Mount St. Helens erupted in the 80s, they had to dig out the channel from the Columbia multiple times because of how much sediment came down the river. And over the course of 10,000 years, you can only imagine how many eruptions are happening. And it's just, the coast up here is so raw. Like there's lava flows, there's ash, there's strong erosion. It seems like...
And who knows what it was like back then, too, to some extent. I mean, you wouldn't want to travel down the coast in a... What'd you call it? A raft of some sort? Yeah. Don't try that at home, kids. It's a brutal coast out here for sure. It's just like rocks and smashing waves. And so did they bring their culture with them from the East? Do you have any sense of, is there like anybody doing anthropological investigations into the origins of these peoples or anything like that?
There have been. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but I am always fascinated by sort of when you see connections, it's hard to know how deep these things go, but it just like as some examples, like, many Native American groups, including in Mesoamerica, where it's quite obvious, like they would depict the moon as having a rabbit in it. And there's myths about, that the moon, when you look at the moon, there's a rabbit, it's not a person. And my understanding is that there also are Asian groups that see a rabbit in the moon rather than a person in the moon. There's also like the association with cardinal directions and particular colors that is pervasive in the Americas. And that also, so if you think of like a Tibetan mandala sand painting, like that sort of it's a cosmogram with the different world directions as different colors. And so you see that. I mean, so those could be like very profound, deep Paleolithic ways of understanding the world that moved from Asia into the Americas.
Did they have cities in Asia prior to this at all? Or anything, urban centers or anything like that?
No one did. Yeah,
nobody did.
At this time, yeah. I mean, so, some of the earlier places, Gobekli Tepe, I understand, is in Ancient Apocalypse. I have to mention, I haven't seen the series. I've just read a lot about it. And so, I don't want to give Netflix the viewership, I guess, like I'd rather do.
They don't need it anyways. They're fine.
But
a strong case for pirating.
Right. Gobekli Tepe, it's hard to say what to call that place. I mean, some people, it was a temporary ceremonial center, like a place that people would gather at, and they built monumental, impressive stuff like sculpted stones. Is that urban? I don't know. I mean, I even teach a class on archaeology of cities, and a lot of it is with students sort of thinking about, well, what makes a place urban? What would we call an urban center? Usually people say like it has functions that are just very different that you can't do in whatever the non-urban part of that region is, right? So, baseline, you could think today, like, an urban place has a post office, or it has a mall, or it has a police office or fire station or something, like those sorts of functions. It has centers of worship, etc.
And it doesn't have food source immediately available. That's what's really interesting, right? Like people in the city get their food from somewhere else.
Yeah, oftentimes they can't. I mean, especially once you get really big cities, like they can't produce all their food, and so they require some sort of tax or tribute from a hinterland. that's a very different, when you're having that sort of relationships, I feel at ease saying that's a city. I mean, that's, and, or, like anonymity. So when you get to settlement size, where not everybody knows you or knows your lineage, knows your people, like knows how to place you, and there's true anonymity, like that to me sort of defines something that's a higher level, a different, qualitatively different type of settlement structure. And I'd feel more comfortable saying, okay, that's really a city.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But so you're not classifying Göbekli Tepe as a city.
I wouldn't, but some people would. I mean, I tend to have a more restrictive definition.
But it's like it's on the border-ish.
Yeah, I could say it has urban functions. It served urban functions.
Is that kind of the oldest? Is that kind of the oldest one?
Yeah, like how old is
What's that? Like 10,000 something?
Yeah, 10, 11.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. So basically, the development of these urban centers in the Mediterranean was happening in a way that was completely disconnected from the lineage that was then developing the urban centers in the Americas.
Right.
After the people had gone over and everything.
Yes. Right. People had already come into the Americas by the time Göbekli Tepe was made.
Okay, so what in the Americas is the oldest place that is an urban center?
So I would say that site Caral that I mentioned, or there are a number of sites in the Supe Valley, which is north of Lima on the coast of Peru. And it's an area that's seeing more work. And so there are other possibilities. Caral's just happens to be the biggest. And it's nicely reconstructed. You can visit it as a tourist. I'd recommend it. It's pretty spectacular to think of. This is a place that was contemporary with the early city-states of Mesopotamia. And no one hears about it. I mean, it doesn't receive much attention sort of in mass media, I suppose. It definitely does in Peru. It's a point of pride in Peruvian archaeology and history.
Did the idea spread out from there? Was it kind of okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think people came up with different models for urbanism. The last time I was on this show, we talked about Poverty Point in northern Louisiana. Now that's later than Caral, but it's still very early, like it's 1500 BCE. And there, it's all the construction is earthen. They don't have rocks like they did in the Supe Valley in Peru. But they made these huge mounds. Like the main mound there is, I think, second to only Cahokia, which is 2,500 years later, around St. Louis, of an earthen mound construction in what is the current United States. And then it has all these sort of concentric ridges and just a very formally organized ritual space, again, by hunter-gatherers, not by agriculturalists. And so we're seeing in areas that were particularly lush in terms of resources could develop semi-sedentary populations who came together and en masse built really impressive things as their ceremonial spaces. And I would call those, urban places. Maybe not true cities, but yeah, certainly urban.
How did they organize do you have a sense of how they organized the building of large structures without having an agricultural basis? Again, this is drawing on the work of my colleagues. It's not my own work, and I don't know it super well, but something impressive for Caral is that they have these bags, these netted bags that are called shikra, and the vegetal material that these netted bags were made of came from the Amazon. So they came across the Andes for this vegetal material that then they were sort of making to lattice-like backpacks, essentially, wow, that then they gathered rocks in and dumped in as fill for these really large pyramids. And then they put a veneer of stones over that. Now, what the archaeologists working there suggest is, so we do know from much later Andean civilization, like the Inca, there's a corvée labor system called mita. And there are indications that corvée labor relation existed prior to the Inca. So for instance, the Moche civilization that's on the Peruvian coast, or the north coast
in the first millennium Common Era. There, all the construction is made out of mud brick, and many of the mud bricks have stamps with signs in them that seem to be like maker's marks, so that the interpretation is that different kin groups or different neighborhoods of the city were providing a certain amount of labor, and they could say, look, these are all our bricks, we've marked them. And so the suggestion, now we're moving back even earlier in time to get to Corral, is that this Shikra construction is some sort of labor accountability, saying, look, our group filled 100 bags of rocks and contributed to building this. And so it's sort of a receipt of that, you contributed in this way.
So there must have been some sort of trade systems in place before these centers even came to be, if people were already acquainted with the idea of trading, using labor in order to achieve something. I mean, I assume they were getting something in return. They weren't slaves, or maybe they were slaves. I don't know. No,
I don't think there's an indication of that. I mean, I think, again, last week we talked about, or whenever I was last on, it's not quite last week, but, that when people are building something that they see as working for them, working for the community, a public work that everybody can have access to or can benefit from, at least in some way, then they'll build really impressive things. I mean, humans have done that throughout history. It's, you see more exploitative labor practices when it's building for the needs of the few, right? So building a palace, building an elaborate mortuary complex for a dead king, that's very different than building a temple that the community agrees is useful for ensuring that the world continues, or that the rains come for the crops, or what have you. Those are like public goods concerns. And early on, relatively small scale societies, if they're committed to it, I think can put forth that labor.
You think there was like a priest class that was directing that initiative?
I would think in a place like Corral, yes, that would be likely. There would be people sort of acknowledged as leaders. They might have, had, so, I mean, I'm drawing on what we know from sort of less hierarchical yet complex societies ethnographically, people who have what we'd call achieved status rather than ascribed status. So they've demonstrated their worthiness to the community. So sometimes they're great orators. They're diplomatic. They solve problems well. They compel people. They have charisma.
They can predict eclipses.
They can predict eclipses. Yeah. So that comes along with maybe some knowledge, like that. There could be knowledge of how the world functions, or religious healing, or other things that the community members find beneficial, and so that power is bestowed with them. Now the difference is that they can't get the people to build them a really fancy house, typically, that or to build them an elaborate tomb. They can't pass their title on to their offspring. That would be what we call achieved status, and we tend to see that later in the sequence.
How do we know these things about something like Norte Chico? It's like you look at photographs of what's been excavated, and it seems like there's not a lot of the kind of soft material that you would be able to use to reconstruct social relationships. And so how do we know these things?
Well, I mean, the preservation is really good. It's like, the coast of Peru is I think technically a desert in terms of the total rainfall. And so there's this great dry preservation. So the fact that you have this like vegetal material from the Amazon that's close to 5,000 years old is pretty amazing. And then that can be directly radiocarbon dated. So can the bones of, any burials there. So can the fish that they were eating and the mollusks that they were eating. All of that can be dated. So in terms of just chronology, that's pretty easy. What we don't see, what I haven't mentioned for actually either Corral or Poverty Point, is pottery. None of them made pottery vessels. They made little amulets. They made like clay figurines, but they were using baskets, and they were just using hide. They had different material culture in terms of like food storage and preparation, and the pottery making cultures come along later. So we often have that. So like in the Near East, that's called the pre-pottery Neolithic where there are these impressive developments like Göbekli Tepe, and they call it, in Peru, they call it the cotton pre-ceramic. So they know that they were growing cotton, but there are no pottery. There is no pottery yet. So that could, inferentially, that could mean that they're not settled. Like people tend to start making pottery when they're going to stay in one place year round, because you don't want to,
so heavy,
schlep all the pots around with you. So having a more portable material culture is good if you're residentially mobile.
When do you see the pottery showing up in Central South America or whatever? Anywhere in America?
Well, let's see. In the Americas as a whole, I think the earliest is around 2500 BCE. So that's, and then it sort of varies what area you're talking about. You tend to get it on coasts more. So actually in the US, on the coast of Georgia, there's some really early pottery. In Mexico, where I work in the Pacific, it's about 2000 or so. In South America, in Ecuador, the Valdivia culture is actually has maybe the claim for earliest pottery using society.
And were these springing up independently, or were they in contact with the Peruvian civilizations?
Oh yeah, they're independent. Yeah, different. And I mean, pottery actually, so people used to think the Jomon culture of northern Japan was the earliest pottery in the world, but now there's been some recent dates from China that go way back, like 19,000.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
That's incredible.
19,000. Okay, so that's actually really interesting that you mentioned China, because we kind of talk about this a lot, where there is an entire body of literature that is locked away in Chinese that isn't translated.
There's a language barrier. It's very difficult to research anything about ancient China.
And so, for us, yeah, I'm sure that there's like publications where you can find it, but I wonder, because for there to be a pottery making group, you said 19,000, not 1900, right?
Right.
That's pretty early if we're talking about the first settlements in the Americas being 5,000 or 5,000 years ago.
Yeah, no, I mean, in fact, so that means that pottery existed in North Asia around the time the first people were arriving to the Americas. So, I mean, they might have been aware that you can fire clay. I mean, that actually, remember that ancient peoples, especially, foragers, hunter-gatherers are really reliant on fire. It's your warmth, it's your light, it's your cooking fuel. And so it's not too hard. You would build a fire in an area that had clay near it, and it's pretty obvious that. So it's really not an intellectual breakthrough. It's just like, at what point is it worth investing time in doing this and then having all this stuff accumulated? And that's usually once people develop farming, like full farming, and they're tied to the landscape. Like they have property that they tend to, and so they're going to stay in one place, and then they'll start making pottery. I guess exceptions to that would be these really lush, often coastal environments where there's just so much marine life that they're eating, mollusks and fish locally, and they don't really need to move, and so that they also could develop pottery. Mm-hmm. But you have to have a commitment to just staying put.
So, what are some of the first civilizations that you see in Central America cropping up? The civilizations that end up becoming, the famous ones, the big pyramids and everything. Yeah.
So, the funny thing in Mesoamerica compared to like the two areas we've talked about, like, the Supe Valley in Peru and the Louisiana Bayou, Poverty Point type area. There's even earlier mounds now documented, like going back to around the same time as Corral 3000 BCE in Louisiana. So there are these rich coastal or riverine environments. Mesoamerica, in contrast, has a more standard development. Like their sequence looks a little bit like the classic model of development in the Fertile Crescent, that first there's agriculture, and then it takes a few thousand years of village living before you start getting the first urban centers. And so, when we see the first urban centers in Mesoamerica, that are at least, large ones. Like we have ones that are, you've maybe heard the term Olmec. The Olmec culture, its center is in the southern Gulf of Mexico region. There are places that have urban functions earlier. They have like a limited amount of public buildings. They have ball courts, like for the Mesoamerican ball game. But they are just sort of like large villages. But by the Olmec period, you get things that you would clearly call towns or even cities that had thousands of people living in them, and had very large monuments and really elaborate art, elaborate stoneworking.
And in terms of the evolution of their culture, what are those monuments and what are their, like, can you tie their figurines or their culture back to anyone before them on the continent? Or where did they come from? Where did they get these? Do they resemble anybody else at all? Do they resemble the Peruvians?
No, not really. Yeah, I mean it's a local tradition. You do tend to get so the earliest art is pretty naturalistic. It depicts humans and animals, like the animals are eating, and figurines depicting people. And then with the Olmec style, it gets much more stylized and abstract. And so it starts with just, you see etching on pottery that has these motifs that might, likely relate to abstract cosmological principles. There's arguments that some are sort of an earth sign, some are a sky sign, and relate to sort of, primal beings, supernatural entities. It then gets, so ceramics is the first way that this style is circulating, and that's something that more people can participate in. Although, like, you'd need to know this, what is the code here? What's the cosmology underlying this symbolic system? But then as the sites get bigger, you also see in places like San Lorenzo and then La Venta, which are the two big Olmec capitals, really elaborate sculpture. So famously, the colossal heads, that are these massive, many-ton basalt carved heads that are very naturalistic. It looks like a person wearing a helmet. They're no two are identical, even though they come in like a cannon. And so those people depict actual people, powerful people, leaders, chiefs, some sort of ruler.
And the ability to actually carve those stones, like, is that something that you see over the course of the civilization, where at first you see rough figurines and craftsmanship that isn't quite so advanced, and then from that emerges the ability to make these enormous basalt heads? Or is it that the smaller stuff hasn't been found yet?
There has been one workshop excavated, and so there's a sense of the development of this style. But I should say it is anomalous that the Olmec style is so natural. It's one of the more naturalistic styles in all of Mesoamerican history, or all of early indigenous America's history. It's rivaled sort of by later Maya classic art or Aztec art in terms of its naturalism. So,
what is naturalism in opposition to?
Well, either being stylized, geometric. So something that's more naturalistic, meaning that it is a more faithful image of what our eyes are seeing. So like that person looks human rather than a little blocky or a little more abstract.
It's not Picasso. I see.
Right. But so Teotihuacan, for instance, is a style that is more abstracted or more stylized, more geometric than the classic Maya or the later Aztec in central Mexico.
And in terms of chronology in Mesoamerica, it's Olmecs and then Teotihuacan, or there's more stuff that's in between them? Yeah, I mean, it's a rich area culturally. So there's what we call Olmecs, and I should say that that label is an imperfect label. It's what Aztec people called ule or oli is rubber. Rubber is indigenous to this lowland area of Mesoamerica and into the Amazon. It's a lowland American tree,
And so it's a reference to the people of the land of rubber, but it's from the much later Aztec civilization. We don't know what they called.
What were they making out of rubber?
Balls, yeah. I mean, so balls
Like,
to play the ball
for the game, yeah.
Yeah. And there's some fascinating work. My colleague here across the river, Mike Tarkian, who's at MIT, has done things with mixing percentages of latex, the sap that comes out of the tree, and there's a particular vine. I'm forgetting the name, but I think it might be in the nightshade family that they're mixing in with it. And it has a chemical reaction that is akin to vulcanization. So it gives it more elasticity and more durability. And you would play with the recipe depending on what you wanted. So obviously you want a ball to be very bouncy and springy, but you want to use rubber that holds a knife blade made of stone into a bone or wood antler to be hard, and that could be more brittle. And so you change the recipe there. People made the soles of sandals out of rubber, and so they had lots of applications for it. And this is so that became a big industry. Actually, even prior to the Olmec, there's ball cord in the Pacific coast of Mexico that is a few centuries before the Olmec civilization. And that just stayed throughout the sequence. So for, 3,500 years, people are still playing Mesoamerican type ball games in Mesoamerica today. There's a huge variety of them. There's, classically, you'll see the hip ball game where the ball would hit a marker or go through a ring on the ball court, but there are lots of others. There are ones that look more like field hockey with sticks. There's ones that are more like handball, hitting the ball with a smaller ball with your hand. Mesoamericans really gave the Americas team sports, right? So that comes out. The World Cup is happening right now, and so people are thinking of that.
Did anybody else pick up on that? Were they trading far and wide? I know that like the Iroquois had lacrosse.
That's right. So the northern woodlands of the U.S. had lacrosse. There are ball courts in the American Southwest, and so the ancestral Puebloan peoples had a variety of the ball game that looks similar. It has the parallel mounds like Mesoamerican ones do. There are also ball courts in the Caribbean. So they seem to have had probably was a diffusion process, contact trading with the Caribbean and the Southwest.
That's so cool.
Yeah, is there a sense for how interconnected these contemporaneous cultures were? Because, trade is one thing, but did they know about each other and without necessarily trading? Are there, one-off artifacts that are ever found that are out of place that could be from somebody, who traveled by themselves and, brought back a souvenir or something?
That's always hard to say. It's really... It's fun to speculate about, but the one example that comes to mind is Spiro is a site in eastern Oklahoma. It's a wonderful site that would be classed as Mississippian period, and it has mounds, but within those mounds is very rich art and offerings, these really nice ceramics, effigy. Ceramics and pipe stones and shell gorgets, having this rich iconography of the Mississippian region, and that dates to roughly around 1200 or so of the Common Era. And there was one scraper, like a hide scraper, made of obsidian that's from the same obsidian source that Teotihuacan and the Toltecs and the Aztecs used in central Mexico. It's very distinctive. It's this green obsidian, and so it's easy to tell that it came from there just optically, but chemically it is also, I think, a match to that source that's known as Sierra de las Navajas, or the Pachuca obsidian source. So how did it make it up there? Was there one sort of Toltec trader going up into that area, or was this sort of just slow down the line trade? We know that the Toltecs were trading up north for turquoise, but that's more in the sort of southwestern area. But perhaps, some of this obsidian was making it up that way, and then people from the southwest were trading with the plains that made it to Spiro. a little hard to say if it's what would be called down the line trade or direct trade. I do know for the Hopewell culture is a really fascinating culture about 2,000 years ago, focused in southern Ohio. And there you get stuff from all over the continental US, like you get grizzly bear teeth and obsidian from the Rockies. You get marine products from the Gulf of Mexico. You get shark teeth from like the Atlantic coast. You get metal from the Great Lakes region. And it sort of descends into Ohio. And there it doesn't seem like there are many intermediary points. So maybe there are people making pilgrimages as part of this trading circuit, or there's just these larger caravan type systems.
Yeah, I grew up in Ohio, and so that was kind of the lore that I grew up in. I always imagined these vast networks of really different, interesting people that were, developing this land before anybody got here. It's also wild because Ohio was basically a big forest back then, from what I understand, and it's basically a cornfield now. And so it was always really interesting as a kid to imagine what it must have been like for those people in such a different time. I think the whole continent must have been a really different place without all of the, changes we've brought upon it in our times.
Yeah.
And, who knows what the travel corridor, what the highways were like back then. But
yeah, my thought when I start thinking about the sort of the way that the landscape has changed is that there are things that have changed, but that it also is maintained, because it's like places that are good to live are going to remain to be places that are good to live. Like there's a river nearby, or there's a coast, or there's a lake or something like that. And you do get these massive changes. Like I think that the 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age changed things pretty precipitously in terms of what's habitable and what's not. But outside of that, the places that were temperate, like, do we have a sense that these sites tend to be continuously inhabited, or they spring up and then they get abandoned and then they're just kind of erased into the landscape until somebody finds them?
I suppose it depends. I mean, so one site I can think of that's really long-lived through what's known as the Archaic period. So the Archaic period is sort of, after the Ice Age, and so you're in the Holocene geologically, but before farming. And there's a site called Coster in Illinois. And here, I mean, this is, like a great place to live. It's floodplain. It's very rich. And so, as hunter-gatherers, then there's animals, there's fresh water, and it's a desirable place. And there are many thousands of years of occupation. It's one of the longest archaeological projects actually in the US has been working through levels at Coster. So that gives you a good glimpse into the sort of transition towards farming, but sort of a not necessarily purposefully driven, but like the thousands of years between the Ice Age and the arrival of maize into that area. In other areas, I suppose it depends. Like people don't always find a city in the most environmentally desirable location. Like a good example of this would be in Oaxaca. So we mentioned the Olmec, the Zapotec. So the Zapotec is actually an ethnicity today. There are over 1 million Zapotec speakers, and that's actually an Aztec term for them. But Zapotec communities will use New or other terms for their communities, and they created a great pre-Hispanic capital at Monte Alban, which is just near Oaxaca City. If you go to Oaxaca today, and there, the earlier settlement was on the valley floor in what would be the best growing land for farming, and they chose this hilltop location. And specialists debate exactly why they chose it, but it would have meant, like going back to earlier in the conversation, that they couldn't produce all their food locally. They needed to draw on a larger catchment area for food, but it must have provided some advantages. Some people think it was, either defensible or a way that they could survey the valley and control it politically. Others think, it might have been more for ritual religious purposes, but it wasn't the best land. But that ended up being one of the longest lived Mesoamerican cities. It's occupied for 1,200 years, and then after its decline was still used as a necropolis for very rich burials. So I suppose it depends, like everything. I mean, there's always, there's cases that support that and others that don't.
I mean, how much is missing still, do you figure? I know that that's kind of like a what are the unknown unknowns question, but do you have a sense from what you've seen excavated and what you've seen maybe with LiDAR studies or your own sort of perception on the situation, like how much of the ancient settlements have we actually discovered versus how many are there?
I think it depends on time period. So like when we're talking about the first settlers in the Americas that leave this very ephemeral trace, their sites are going to be, deeply buried or much more difficult to find. I think there's a lot more to discover in terms of just locating the site. So, locating the site is part of the story for archaeology, but then really understanding it and trying to piece together, the why of, why did it exist? How are people making a living here? What was life like? That really, I mean, there'll be no end to that. And that's partially why I think we need to be teaching the methods at some level, even in a K through 12 curriculum. So like just understanding, how do we know that this obsidian or this metal or whatever the resource is came from this place? How can we tell that chemically? Like there are chemical analyses. How can we tell what people ate just based on different stable isotopes in their bones? Like these are fascinating methods and they're rapidly developing and they're giving us a much better toolbox for understanding the past. And so that's fun. It's like I think you could engage lots of people into science fields by saying, well, here's the applications. We can understand ourselves better, the history of humanity better.
Yeah, I think that's what it's all about, is people really want to understand themselves. They want to know where they came from, where the country, what was happening on this land before I got here. And I think like the more vivid picture that we can paint for kids, the more engaging it's going to be, really. Mm-hmm. What do you, so we were talking about the evolution of the cultures and societies in central Mesoamerica. You have something like your favorite place, this Teotihuacan. What's going on? Does that just appear out of nowhere? Is it? Is there something going on beforehand? How does a big city like that just pop into existence?
Okay, well, that now we're something I know. So I'm happy to answer that question. So I mean, a lot of my career is focused both on Teotihuacan, but then also what came immediately before it. So we call that period the formative period in central Mexico, and it's sort of once you have established farming villages, and we've excavated some of those that go back to about 1000 BC in the area, and then the development of smaller towns. So I worked for 6 or 7 years at a pre-Teotihuacan town that it had its own little pyramids and plaza and ball court. There were much bigger ones that were contemporary to that. There were places that I would actually call a city. So for instance, in the southern basin of Mexico, on the southern fringe of Mexico City today, is a site called Cuicuilco. And that, for me, is the first true city in central Mexico. It maybe had 20,000 people living in it. It had these big pyramids. They're weird because they're round, and that's not a typical building style. There are some round pyramids, but in West Mexico, they had some round pyramids, and there might have been some ties with those folks over there. But it does seem to have been, central Mexico, where Mexico City is today, was historically a crossroads between, in Mesoamerica, there were people from the east, from the Gulf, from more humid tropical areas, and then this large high plains. Are they bringing that
Olmec, some of those Olmec traditions in, and are there the Peruvian influences coming up?
So not Peruvian, but there were Olmec sites in central Mexico. One of the interesting things, though, is they had very different uses of the art. So they made things in the same style, like these, sort of where, like people call them were babies, like, so they look like part jaguar, part baby. They have big cheeks and snarling mouths, and it's a like sort of distinctive art style. They would do things like that, but the narratives tended to be much more mythic. We can't sort of identify necessarily, okay, here's a ruler. They seem to have been dealing more in these abstract religious concepts. And that continues in Teotihuacan. So again, if you remember, like in Teotihuacan, we haven't clearly identified a ruler. So there was just a different way of framing power and, one's place in the world in central Mexico through the formative and into the classic period. Things change with the collapse of Teotihuacan. It gets a little more individualized, associated with the small city-states that rose after the collapse of Teotihuacan, and interactions with the Maya area that also had this more sort of individualized art and way of recording history through hieroglyphs. But yeah, we can see that really clearly. And so, one thing that I've focused on some are the origins of certain deities that we see prior to Teotihuacan. So there are definitely two that are prominent in the first millennium BCE. There's the storm god and the old god of fire. And they're sort of, it's like an important dualism in central Mexico, fire and water. It's used metaphorically for many things. It's sort of a creative, generative force. The main Aztec temple had the storm god paired with Huitzilopochtli, who's this solar god. There always was sort of this coupling of these two primal elements. That goes back way, into the first millennium BCE. They also, you start seeing trends in urban planning. So in central Mexico, the typical arrangement starts to be that your major pyramid is to the east looking west, and then maybe you have a second pyramid to the north looking south. Where I excavated in this site, La Laguna, before Teotihuacan, they had that arrangement. Teotihuacan has that exact arrangement. Now, it's very different. It's on a totally different scale, much larger, and has this large avenue, the Street of the Dead, between it. But we can see certain principles in urban planning, like being converged upon by different communities. And then there's sort of a grand synthesis in Teotihuacan, which takes it in all sorts of new directions.
And all without centralized leadership somehow, which is very...
Well, no, Teotihuacan...
Or hierarchical
leadership.
Okay.
But I think it was less individualized. So it was more maybe bureaucratic, more corporate. There might have been more decision makers. And, we can look to later central Mexico for some models here where there were sort of ruling councils. There are systems of co-rule where 2 to 4 different rulers or different heads of state converged on decisions. It could have been something more along those lines than the classic sort of god-king model of, say, classic Maya civilization or other pharaonic Egypt.
I want to go back real quick to the evolution of the gods that you mentioned, like the storm gods and the fire god. I had 2 questions about that. One is, can you trace that out into the other American civilizations? Is there a thread of that? Is it a commonality at all? And then 2 is, did they peg that to the stars at all?
So they, there are storm god traditions throughout Mesoamerica. They all are somewhat distinctive. So there's a Zapotec storm god, a Mayan storm god. Not surprisingly, they seem to be more emphasized in more semi-arid settings. Like, so the people there who wanted the rains to come, like they were more invested in the storm god and made them a larger divinity or more central divinity. The old god of fire is, some people have argued that the storm god maybe has roots in the Olmec tradition, Olmec iconography. There are some similarities like the snarling jaguar mouth that you see in it. But that ultimately was a earth deity within what we think was the Olmec tradition. The old god of fire, it seems totally Central Mexican. It's like very distinctive. It's an old man with sort of a wrinkled face. I don't know if I have any. I have the storm god behind me here, but I don't have any old gods. And hunched over. and he has a brazier that so one of the cool things is that the earliest ways of depicting these deities was on ceramics that were functional. So behind me, there's a black storm god water pot. So you would actually, it would hold water in it. And he's actually holding another pot, like just to index, and he has a lightning bolt in his other hand. So you really know it's the storm god. And then the old god of fire has a big brazier on his head or sort of by his back that, he's supporting up Atlas-like, and that they would burn fire in. So like there are functional, engagements with these particular elements. And it continues all the way through the Aztec sequence. You see, the storm god is very prominent. The old god sort of morphs into something else who's like the old guy in the center of the universe. But they're really central to all the offerings in the Aztec Templo Mayor, their main temple.
And you can imagine there being some convergence there, right? Like even in Mesopotamia and like the Canaanite traditions, you see the storm god being prevalent. And it just seems like it would make sense that people would be staring at the same phenomena or negotiating the same crises on a civilization level.
Yeah, it is. It's fun. One of my colleagues who works in the Eastern Mediterranean mentioned that once, but she was saying it's just interesting how some societies really emphasize the storm god and some don't at all. But yeah, there are other societies that emphasize storm gods. I mean, in fact, that is often then becomes the king of the gods because the storm god is in the sky. It throws light. So think of Zeus and Jupiter. They have these storm-like attributes. In the early Judeo-Christian God or the God of the Old Testament speaks in a thundering voice. So there are some proposals that it sort of came out of the tradition of Baal, which is a Phoenician storm god.
Yeah, and it's one thing I also noticed is just that everybody's seeing the same thing happen in the sky at night too. And so a lot of the myths that come out of telling the story, of Venus and of the moon and these things, it makes sense that people would come up with kind of similar stories. Do you see any of the gods being pegged to the astronomy at all?
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, an interesting difference is for in Mesoamerica, Venus was the feathered serpent. So Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs, Kukulkan to the Maya. I don't know if you saw Wakanda Forever. There's Kukulkan. You should see the new Black Panther movie. There's a Kukulkan character. But in any case, that's the feathered serpent. And that's the embodiment of Venus. That's quite different than, say, the Greco-Roman tradition, where since Venus was close to the sun, it was perceived as a consort of the sun and gendered feminine, and that's different than the Mesoamerican tradition. But they did know, Mesoamerican peoples realized it was one celestial body, so they didn't sort of say morning star, evening star. They tracked it very closely. They knew that the cycle was 582 or 83 days. So that's like the appearance cycle for Venus. As it's in the morning, it goes away. It's in the night sky and it goes away. And they were fascinated by that cycle. And I forget if I mentioned last time, but there's, good evidence that a lot of the major cycles that people in Teotihuacan cared about were encoded into buildings, into the major pyramid complexes of the city. And this, the work of a colleague, Saburo Sugiyama, who's worked on trying to determine what the standard unit of measurement was at Teotihuacan, and I think has a very good case that it was 83.3 centimeters. It's not just totally out of the blue. We have Aztec parallels of there being like the Aztec yard was sort of from your hands to your heart, and that was used as one of the standard units of measurement, and there were others, but that is roughly about 83 centimeters. And then also when you look at Teotihuacan, there are many things that are just measure 83 centimeters, or there are ratios of it. So like staircases are often in nice geometric ratios where the balustrades are some divisible ratio of what the steps are. And once you start playing around with those numbers, the Sun Pyramid is 260, which is the ritual calendar in Mesoamerica. The Moon Pyramid, when it got monumental, was 105, which is the remainder to make the solar year of 365. And the big citadel complex that has the feathered serpent pyramid at its heart is a Venus cycle, is 582.
Where do you get the 260 from?
So 260 is key to Mesoamerica. So Mesoamericans, and it's actually one of the things that sort of defines the culture area, they use two calendars. They observe the solar year, but then they also had a ritual calendar. They used a vigesimal system, so a base 20 system. And so for the ritual calendar was 13 months of 20 days. And that the Aztecs called the Tonal Poali, the count of fate. And the solar year was 18 months of 20 days. And it was also Shumo Poali, which is the count of days. That gives you 360. And then there was this sort of 5-day remainder around that was sort of like a period where people just hung out at home. You didn't do anything, I mean, it was...
That sounds nice.
Like observant. Yeah. You didn't want to rock the boat too much. It was like a transitional New Year period. And they knew to intercalate too. So they knew that every 4 years, that period was going to be 6 days instead of 5 days, so that they were keeping the solar calendar going. But in any case, those two cycles were key to Mesoamerican life. And they would come together every 52 years. And so that sort of for Mesoamericans was like a century. And the Aztec calendar would often measure time in terms of the 52-year cycle. There was a huge sort of rite of passage ceremony every 52 years. And that really seems to have been key and central to Teotihuacan. Like it might have been the first city that really elaborated the calendar round as sort of a place for pilgrimage and those sorts of events. And so, they encoded those all throughout, the architecture and into elements of sculpture, the big braziers that's associated with the new fire ceremony that you would have.
But why 260? Why 260? That's such a strange number. Does it? Yeah.
There, I think, two reasonable hypotheses for 260. One is, so we already talked about there being like most early until the French Revolution, right? Most people measured things in an anthropocentric way, right? They use the human body, right? So we still have, in English, we have an inch that's like the joint of your thumb, and we have a foot, etc. And those are older ways of measuring things in proportion to the human body. And one idea for 260 is if you have a vigesimal system, if you're using a base 20 system, it's the closest to a human gestation period that you could get. So one idea is that it comes from the creation of a human, and that's important. The other is that it has to do with Venus. And so Venus, like the times that it's visible are sort of close to 260. And so it's, if they were really focused on that, they maybe wanted to bring that cycle and try to reconcile it with the solar and lunar ones.
Yeah, that's interesting, because then Venus disappears for a week or so. And I think there's a lot of underworld myths tied to this in all cultures, like all the way back to the Sumerians and so forth, which is kind of interesting. I assume the Teotihuacanis had a similar story.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, another thing I should mention is the alignment of Teotihuacan, where the sun pyramid looks, where the sun sets from the sun pyramid or where it rises, it doesn't really matter. But what the grid system does is divide the year into 260 and 105. So you'll see sunset there on August 13th, and then I think it's April 30th. And that is, the intervals between them are 260 and 105. So they really seem to want to make sense of how do you reconcile all these ways of counting time. Human time, celestial time.
That makes sense.
What were they keeping time for? That sounds like a stupid question, right? But people always talk about, like, we invented clocks, and when we had clocks, it basically, like, set us on this path of modernization that has now, forced everybody to be in this constant hurry. But it's like, what motivates an agricultural urban center to begin to focus so deeply on the stars? Is it because it gives you something that you can predict, and through those predictions appear to be wise? Do you have any insight on that?
So some people say, okay, they want to have an accurate calendar so they know when to plant. Maybe there's something to that, but if you we do have, like, actually, I think I noticed last week, I read like what are the best sellers in fiction and nonfiction. The Farmer's Almanac was like 1 or 2 in nonfiction, right? So people still like the Farmer's Almanac. Essentially, that's what Mesoamericans were doing. They were doing these almanacs, but at the same time, you don't necessarily need the stars to know when to plant or what the sun's doing. There's other ways, like I think like if the leaves of a tree are of this size, that's a good time to plant. Like there are other visual cues from nature that people could keep in mind when they're going to plant again, or just observing. Like, so in central Mexico, the gambit is always when are the rains going to come? Because the rains are very seasonal, and once they're coming consistently, you want to plant, because then if your harvest stretches too much into September or October, you can face frosts and hails. So you have this very like limited growing time. And so it's important to sort of get a sense of when the right time is. But, if you plant too early, then you've lost all that seed and you've lost your investment there. So I could see some of that argument, but I'm a little skeptical, because I think farmers just take cues from like observing nature around them, and they don't necessarily need that. But
it seems like you could like run the danger of over rationalizing it too. Like these people had a very different cosmology. Like the world was a very different thing. The things in the sky weren't, glowing bodies of molten material and so forth. Like they were something else. Everything was very anthropocentric, geocentric. It was like you're trying to tell the story, and you have these myths that go along with them, which, it's easy for us to call them myths, but for them, it was probably like, this is how it works. Like, this is how the universe unfolds.
It's the code of life. It's the code of the cosmos. It's the one thing that you can just keep track of. Like if you're just trying to make sense of what are we doing here on this planet, like the best way to observe it, these things that are dominating our lives, like obviously the sun is so critical to everything, and just watching how it moves. And then, the moon is also doing cool stuff, and then Venus is the next brightest thing in the sky. And so, I think it really just gives meaning. Like those cycles are the basis of human religion, largely. So much of it. And the way that we structure our lives and thinking about, our own human time within this bigger cosmic time. And so much of religion and mythology is just trying to reconcile those two.
Yeah, and the planets in particular are strange, right? Like especially the outer ones from us, you can see them do these weird dances in the sky that don't totally make sense. It's very, people were obviously didn't reconcile the whole geocentric thing for well into, the rational period of Eastern or of Europe. And so it's easy to imagine how these very predictable but like inexplicable motions at the same time would be important to understand, because
I'm pretty sure the etymology of planet is wanderer, and it's in Greek or Latin.
Yeah, that's right.
I should know which language, but it comes from the term for wanderer, because they're doing funky stuff.
Yeah. So all right. So were the Teotihuacan is the first real metropolitan area in Americas, or was this the first real convergence of cultures? Or I've worked there for 20 plus years. I am clearly invested in the place and have an affinity for it, and I don't mean to say this is the most special place in the world. It is for me, and maybe you should visit it and see if you agree. But I do think you could make the case it's the earliest like cosmopolitan center of the Americas. But again, it's like, what does branding it that way really do for you? But what I could say is that we think that there were at least 5 different languages spoken in the city. There was continual migration into the city. So we know this especially recently through stable isotope analysis of bone. And just the basic way that works is that, as we consume water and plants and animals in a particular environment, there are signatures of certain
trace elements like strontium is one that's used often, but actually people have been working with oxygen and lead isotopes also. And just looking at small, subtle differences and usually you sample either the bedrock or the groundwater of different regions. And it's just very subtle differences in the ratios of, say, strontium 87 to strontium 86. And when we consume like the biome that comes from a particular region, because remember, in the past, it's not like you're not getting your cantaloupes from China or, like food is largely localized. And that's important for this technique to work. But like one thing you can tell is just is someone a migrant, yes or no, regardless of where they came from. And the way that you can tell that is the difference between your tooth or your teeth and your skeleton. And the reason is because, as our teeth erupt and develop in childhood and then become covered with enamel, they seal in the signature of wherever we developed, wherever we were born and grew up. But the rest of our body keeps flushing through these isotope ratios throughout our lives. So if you see an individual that has a very divergent isotopic ratio for their teeth and from the rest of their body, you can tell that they moved at some point from their place of origin. Now, where exactly they moved from gets a little more tricky, but many of my colleagues, I'm not involved in this work, but they've sampled they've sampled from the project that I co-direct in Tlahinga in the southern periphery of Teotihuacan. They'll also go around sampling the bedrock and the groundwater, try to get signatures for different regions, and then say, okay, this population looks like it came from Oaxaca. This one looks like it came from West Mexico. This one looks like they came from the Gulf of Mexico. Now we also have that's not the only line of evidence that we have. We have artifacts, right? So we know in the case of some parts of Teotihuacan, there are Gulf of Mexico fish that had been smoked or salted. So the bones of snapper and other, and we're up 1.5 miles above sea level at Teotihuacan. So these came from the Gulf of Mexico. People must have been salting or preserving them in some way to bring them up into the highlands. We have cotton couldn't be grown in Teotihuacan, so that had to come from the lowlands. We have in the case of there's a district called the Oaxaca barrio, the Zapotec barrio, where there are ethnic Zapotecs living there who carved their own hieroglyphs that are different from the Teotihuacan writing system. They depicted their own storm god. They buried their dead slightly differently than the Teotihuacanos did and continued that ethnic identity. So based on all of those lines of evidence, we can say that at any given time in Teotihuacan, probably something like 1/4 to 40% or so of the population was born somewhere else and had migrated to the city. Now, for comparison, today, the US is about 15% not born here, migrant population. But an interesting note, if you're listening to the World Cup coverage, that I saw was that 9 out of every 10 people in Qatar were not born there. So you have like a range today of like pretty migrant heavy place like the United States is at 15, but Qatar is all the way at 90%, and Teotihuacan is somewhere in the middle at like 25 to 40%.
I wonder what New York City would be. It's really interesting.
Probably different throughout the ages too.
Yeah. Well.
In Teotihuacan, do you have a sense for who was it that started building the pyramids? Was it something that came along when the city was already pretty metropolitan and had a lot of different cultures that came together? Or was there one culture that established the city and then was the mover and the shaker in terms of building? Yeah,
so that's a great question and still not resolved. But so what was the dominant ethnicity or ethnic identity of central Mexico? Because the other populations I've been talking about are migrant populations. So Zapotecs came from Oaxaca. There are, the Maya came from the Yucatan and Central America. Gulf Coast populations might have been Totonac speakers. People from Michoacan would have spoken a West Mexican language. But what was the baseline Central Mexican dominant ethnicity? It probably was not just a single one. At the time of the Spanish invasion, the two dominant ethno-linguistic groups were Nahuatl, or the Aztecs, who their descendants refer to themselves as Nahuas, and the language that they speak is Nahuatl. And then there's also the Otomís, or the Hnu, which the Otomi is like the Aztec term for them. It's a different language group. It's tonal. I can't speak it at all. I mean, I have isolated Nahuatl vocabulary, but it was a really important second, and still is today, ethno-linguistic group in central Mexico. It is in the same language family as Zapotec and Mixtec in Oaxaca. So there's that language family is sort of tethered to the central and southern highlands of Mexico. There still are, actually, I work with a family at Teotihuacan who are Otomi and speak Otomi. So there still are people in the valley who speak that particular language. Now, why is there debate? Because the arrival of, so the Aztecs say that they migrated from somewhere else to the northwest. Historical linguists who've worked on the issue have proposed for a long time that it is sort of a more recent incursion. So Nahuatl is in the Uto-Aztecan family, which is the largest language family in the Americas. It spans from around where you are in southern southern Utah into northern California, down through the Puebloan languages of the Southwest, and all the way through central Mexico, with Nahuatl being the dominant language, but then even isolated populations getting all the way to El Salvador and Nicaragua. Where that originated and how it expanded is still somewhat contested. But the two dominant hypotheses are that the main ethno-linguistic group at Teotihuacan was either a proto-Nahuatl group, like a precursor directly to the Aztec language, or a proto-Otomi speaking group.
But in terms, yeah, I mean, it seems like a difficult thing to pin down, but it's like, in terms of building the pyramids, like, what is when you excavate, do you find a continuity of the structure, or is there something that was built that was smaller that something is then built on top? Like, what does it actually look like in terms of the construction?
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. And they all differ. All three are different. So the three biggies at Teotihuacan are the Sun, Moon, and Feathered Serpent pyramids. The Moon Pyramid that's where I started in Teotihuacan. And that project was directed by Seguro Sugiyama and Ruben Cabrera, a Japanese researcher and a Mexican researcher. And it involved tunneling. So the pyramid had been reconstructed in the 60s. I might have mentioned this last time, but it was in anticipation for the Olympics, and the Olympic torch was taken up on the top of the Moon Pyramid. But it just sort of was slapped together for tourists. Like, this looks like a coherent monument. But it wasn't really scientifically excavated. That started in the late 90s and through the 2000s with tunneling underneath it, so you wouldn't damage the facade of the later structures. And that documented 7 different construction phases. And the first 3 were quite modest, I think 20, 30 meters on a side, little temples, similar to the small town that I excavated at La Laguna that was centuries before. And then it got monumental and measured 105 Teotihuacan metric units later, sometime sort of probably in the 200s. The Sun Pyramid is the biggest. And what's fascinating is when the Sugiyamas excavated there more recently, they found that it really was built in one construction episode. There were earlier structures there, but they don't look like temples. There's like random walls and maybe some enclosure was there, but there wasn't like a big bulk. And so it wasn't an accumulated construction process. The Feather Serpent Pyramid, also the one we see today, the tourists look at, it was the smallest of the 3, but it's heavily sculpted and it's made in the nicest dressed stone that you find at Teotihuacan. So a lot of attention went into that, working the stone and making the sculptures of the Feathered Serpent. That was all built in a one-shot deal also. But Sergio Gomez, who recently excavated the tunnel that runs underneath the temple, found sculptures relating to the same theme. So there's like rattlesnakes' tails and bird headdresses. So there is some mix of like bird, avian, serpent type imagery. So there could have been something earlier there that then was dismantled and they built the new one on top.
Yeah, what's up with those tunnels, by the way? Was that done at the same time as the temple itself, or is that from something earlier? Or have they been finished with that? What's the story with those? I understand they've been kind of sealed up and nobody's working on them right now, or?
Well, I was just in the one under the Feathered Serpent Pyramid in August. It is largely totally excavated. There were last sort of few offerings that the team was excavating. But that was early. Yeah, that was built like it in the 1st century and into the 2nd century, and then it was totally sealed over. So it has some of the earliest materials from Teotihuacan. It is under what it used to be under the water table, so it has wet preservation of organic materials. So it's fantastic. Like there are all these seeds and wood and animal remains that can be very securely dated. There's evidence of interaction with as far away as the Maya. So like there's these big trumpet strombus shells that would be used as trumpets that are etched in sort of Maya style etchings. There's materials from Oaxaca and other distant regions. So already in the 1st century Common Era, Teotihuacan was sort of international, or already had these long distance interaction networks.
But from what I heard, the discovery of the tunnel was like there was some storm that happened and the ceiling collapsed and then the tunnel was discovered. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there was a lot of heavy rains, and that led to sort of creation of a sinkhole that then they started digging out. And that was this shaft that goes down 15 meters into the volcanic tuff substrate of central Mexico, which is called Tepetate. It's very hard stuff. And remember, they didn't have metal tools, so they had to use these sort of fire hardened sticks to chunk it out. And they did that for over 100 meters distant to go under where the eventual pyramid would be.
Do you think that there are other tunnels that haven't been found yet?
So there is one under the Sun Pyramid, but that one was looted. So the one under the Feathered Serpent Pyramid and looted in antiquity. The one under the Feathered Serpent Pyramid was kept sealed. So sort of like the difference, we're at the 100th anniversary of the discovery of King Tut's tomb. And, King Tut was this minor pharaoh for Egypt, but his tomb wasn't broken into. And so you saw all these amazing things. For Teotihuacan, that's like the tunnel under the Feathered Serpent Pyramid that remained intact, while who knows what was in the Sun Pyramid one, probably also really spectacular stuff, but that had been cleaned out in antiquity. Now, another colleague, Veronica Ortega, she using geophysical perspection techniques in front of the moon pyramid has detected something that she suggests could be another tunnel going under the moon pyramid. And so then if that's the case, then that could be another unexplored one.
In terms of the discovery of Teotihuacan, there was this really hilarious meme that was going around, I don't know, probably like a week or two ago, which was this picture of Teotihuacan when it was discovered, which is just this like perfectly flat plain, and then on top of it is just this absurd little hill, and then underneath it is the picture of like excavated, and so it's intended to show that it's just this obvious mound on a perfectly flat plain. But from what I saw of the original photos, that's not at all what it looked like when it was discovered, right?
It would have been grass covered. I mean, there are even photos there. So let's see, there are paintings of it that date back to, I think, the 18th century. I didn't see this particular meme. I'm surprised because I think it would come across my channels. But it looked like a big grassy covered hill.
That's what the meme looks like. Yeah, I thought it was true. But
I will follow up, and we will determine if it's true or not.
What I'm curious about is that what the Aztecs came up in the wake of? Do you think that they had a sense of this was a fallen civilization? Was it kind of like a skeleton in their closet? Like, what was that like? What did they see?
No, I think they knew. Well, so I think they saw it both ways. So there's a lot of myth history from the Aztecs about Teotihuacan. It is the place where time began, where the fifth sun was set in motion, where the gods sacrificed themselves for humanity. But at the same time, people lived around the site. People were excavating things, and they actually made offerings of Teotihuacan materials that they excavated in their holiest of holies in the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan. So seeing that material culture, they must have known, okay, these are people who used a technology very similar to ours. So I don't know how they, reconciled the two, that there's sort of a mythic understanding of the place where the calendar was set in motion, the fifth sun was created, but at the same time that there were people here who had a material culture that was relatively similar to ours. So I mean, for a similar situation, there's Cholula. Cholula was like contemporary with Teotihuacan. It actually existed even before Teotihuacan. And continues up to present. It's still a city today. So it's one of the longest lived cities in the Americas, over 2,000 years of dense occupation. But the classic period pyramid, which by volume is probably the largest in the world, fell into disuse in this period where there was unrest and shifting city-state changes, and eventually got covered over with grass. And then the later Cholulteca who lived there at the time of the Spanish invasion, they called it the Tlachihualtepet, the human-made mountain. And they depict it in codices. So you can actually see painted native books that have this big hill covered in grass, and it's labeled Tlachihualtepet because this is the early days of using alphabetic writing for Nahuatl. And so they are actually iconographically representing it as a very large grass-covered hill, but saying by the name that they understand that it's human-made.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
It is really fascinating.
Yeah, it's tempting to speculate that a lot of the cyclic cosmology came down to seeing these old versions of something that resembled themselves and, trying to reconcile that with where their own civilization was headed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that could, people have suggested that for the narrative of the five suns, that these were, maybe it links to previous known pre-Hispanic civilizations like the Toltecs, Teotihuacanos, Olmecs, etc.
I wonder if it would change like the arrogance of our civilization if there was just like a crumbled down New York City next to New York City, or if we had some way of gripping the past in that like tangible sense.
Yeah, like what do you think studying these ancient places offers people? Like what is the most urgent thing that it brings to people's lives?
I mean, there's a lot of ways to think about that. I think there's just a natural human curiosity with where we came from. And so, people find meaning in lots of things. I find it meaningful to sort of situate myself within these broader historical currents. And, so I've found this career fulfilling doing that. But, I also think there's like clear connections with other populations. There are indigenous Mesoamericans today who are the direct heirs to these traditions. And so we're having lots of, international debates about how do we treat the remains of the past? Where should they be? What's the role of museums? What's the balance between repatriating things to the countries that they were often stolen from during, colonial endeavors, and education, or, having museums that display things from around the world? There's all of that debate. And then there's sort of what can we learn in terms of just understanding the deep sequence of history. So, if we only sort of look at current events or the last couple hundred years of modern societies, we have a relatively small pool to draw from of how humans have historically tackled problems in the past, like living in cities, like, dealing with climatic crises. And I wouldn't say that like studying ancient cities is just going to directly give brand new insights into how to deal with climate change. But I do think that there are lessons from the past. So like, why has Cholula survived as a dense urban center for 2,000 years? What did it do to be resilient, to sustain its population for so long? What are the cases that failed? Like, what went wrong in times of crisis? And that is something I've been working on with colleagues in different ways of thinking about Mesoamerican cities and what they can offer us for either dealing with urban issues today, issues of infrastructure, issues of governance, and trust on the part of a populace and the broader mission of the group affiliation that they have, whether it's a city or a polity. And I do think there are lessons there. I mean, obviously you got to do climate science, you got to work on policy, but like, it is also why I bristle at just what I think is sort of unethical use of the past, of just sort of making stuff up and going against like all the basis of empirical knowledge that we have. And I get it. I mean, it's not taught in schools. It's not the fault of teachers, certainly, because but like when we do an intro class in archaeology, which I've done for many years, there are students who are cognitively 18 and they've come through high school, they know a lot. But in terms of their archaeological knowledge, they're like a 14-year-old or a 12-year-old. I mean, there's no foundation there other than, oh yeah, I remember the Egyptians, built the Sphinx and et cetera. Like they don't understand the methods. They don't understand how do we put these things in a sequence? How do we use materials to reconstruct the human past? And I think if we added some more of that to a K through 12 type curriculum, then we just have a more informed citizenry. And I think the U.S. has particular challenges, to be honest. Like I've gone other places. For instance, Atapuerca is this Paleolithic site in Spain. I think it's the richest fossil site for early human remains anywhere in the world yet discovered. And it has this magnificent rock cliff shelter with the whole stratigraphic sequence. You go on a tour there and you get explained, the actual site. There's a museum to human evolution. There's an interpretive center where you learn to make fire, hitting chert together or throwing with an atlatl or, doing these Paleolithic type technologies. And what really struck me is, we were there on a Sunday. Admission was not free. You had to pay. Nevertheless, there are all these people there just really invested in learning about the past. And it was this sort of level of interest that I think we have a little more trouble with in the US. And part of that is our colonial history. So having something like, oftentimes people connect with the past when they feel like that is our past, that is the past of our nation. And that can have a really bad side too. Like, so, Hitler used the past for nationalist purposes, right? So nationalizing the past can be very, very toxic. But at the same time, it gives like a natural buy-in, a natural hook to people, and it makes communicating about it a little easier and working it into school curricula a little easier too.
And I think that it's more attractive to be able to look into history and not have to grapple with all of the horrible things that your ancestors have done, and be able to have this past where you're able to be proud of the lineage. And I think you're right about the United States having a particularly
we're so young
hard time.
too, and we're at the height of our preeminence to some extent. It's like there's nothing to really look back to here in terms of like big powerful civilization or something.
Yeah, like I often wonder, like 10,000 years from now, what the culture will be like, and like what stories will it be able to tell about itself, and how will it deal with the sort of the origins, if there are still recordings of it. And I imagine that these things get glossed over by history given enough time, so you can start to tell yourself a different story. because you look through the history of Europe, and there's terrible conquests of the pagans and of the Celts, and like empires come and they destroy them, and there is not really that same rawness to it, because it happened a long enough time ago that it's so outside of living memory that people can't hold on to it the same way that we can in the United States, because it's so recent. There's not really a question there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's harder to work on this sort of interest in the aggregate past, or the past of humanity can be very abstract. I also think there's a very unique American tendency, I mean, that comes out of this colonial history of ours for, people who are not indigenous to the United States or North America, to then want to try to create meaning. So what is it? What are we doing here? Like what existed here earlier? And I do think that's where these sort of pseudoscience narratives of, oh, well, there was this earlier civilization that we're all related to and that underlies all the continents can be appealing, because it sort of, it makes it feel like, oh, well, there's more meaning to be here. And so, that might be something we're particularly susceptible to.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about. I mean, one thing I have to say, I feel like if people find us 10,000 years from now, they're going to think we're Romans, probably. If they look at our city and our judicial buildings, and the even our laws are written in Latin largely. I mean, a lot of the legal lingo is in Latin, and you can definitely draw a line between us and the Greeks, basically, which is kind of fascinating. But anyways, gosh, we've taken a lot of your time today, and I know you've already been out here once, and we didn't get to the Iberian Peninsula too much, but maybe down the line a little ways.
Yeah.
Sure.
Do you have any closing thoughts?
Anyone who's compelled by shows like Ancient Apocalypse, just please engage with the real methods. There's no hidden agenda here. We want to all be able to collectively have a basis for making arguments and understandings about the past, and there are tools to do that. And so learning a little bit about them can help there. And I think it creates a very fulfilling way of understanding the world and where we fit in it. And one that we can learn from. So the past isn't just sort of a sci-fi story. It's the story of us, and it can help guide us in the future. It's not going to resolve all our problems, but it creates a much larger data set that we can draw on comparatively in thinking about what might be in the range of possibility.
That ties really neatly to something one of our other guests said. Lance Weaver, he works at the Utah State Geology Office, and he came up in a culture that's really Mormon, and so there's a lot of creationism, and he's a geologist. And when he first got into school, he had come from this very creationist world, and so he did geology kind of because he figured he would be able to take it in this more skeptical direction. And he said that he was like, I really wish that everyone that I ever spoke to about geology would be able to just take a first-year class, like Geology 101, in order to be able to understand the methods and the foundations, because so many of these mysteries and this ability to grab people's imagination comes exactly from what you're saying. It's a lack of exposure to the basics. And so that's something to think about too for the long run. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's good you're doing what you're doing to demystify these fields.
I appreciate that.